everyone, Katarina here. Thank you for joining me today. In this video, I have a Christmas card number 10 for you. This is a super simple card, as long as you have the supplies, of course. I really wanted to make this card for a while, just using a detail stencil, embossing paste and embossing powder. After long search for stencils, all of them constantly sold out, I found a stencil from Hero Arts. If you want to do this card, you can use any other stencil you have in your stash. For the embossing, I used a white plain cardstock from papermilldirect. I also knew I wanted to put a colored cardstock to frame the embossed panel. I wanted the colored cardstock to be slightly smaller than the card base, meaning the white cardstock had to be even smaller. I did all the cutting off camera. I placed the stencil on top of the white panel and secured it with washi tape. Then I spread the embossing paste across the panel with a stencil, or actually this is a texture paste from Ranger. I have no idea what is the difference. I used my palette knife to apply the texture paste on top of the stencil. I just made sure that the paste filled all the places on the stencil and that it's smooth. Once I was happy with the look, I closed the lid on the texture paste so it doesn't dry, and also I cleaned up my palette knife. The texture paste doesn't dry immediately, but it dries quite quickly, so you need to be a little bit more quicker than normally. I carefully removed the washi tape together with the stencil. I also had a bowl of water next to my desk and put the stencil into it so I don't have to run to clean it up. It is very important to not let the embossing paste to dry on the stencil, because then it would ruin it. I also cleaned up my mat and used the palette knife again just to smooth out the embossing paste that was hanging off the sides of the panel. Then I took an embossing powder to sprinkle over the whole panel. The embossing powder I used for the first card was the Azure Mist from Wow. This is a light blue glittery embossing powder. I wasn't sure if you can heat emboss right away once you add the embossing powder, or the texture paste needs to dry. So I just let it on a side for the texture paste to dry and started working on my next panel. I saw other card makers using stencils and embossing paste, and they often use distress ink or other inks to change color of the embossing paste. This is something I really wanted to try, and this is what I'm going to be doing on the second panel. First, I secured the stencil on top of the white panel. Again, I used my washi tape for that. I had a green glittery embossing powder, so I wanted to make the texture paste green, and used the Mowed Lawn Distress ink for that. I just squished the ink onto a laminated cardstock and added in the texture paste. I also used my palette knife to mix those together. Once I got the ink and the texture paste mixed, I applied it to the white panel with the stencil. Just like on the first panel, I made sure I have the texture paste spread evenly across the stencil and that it's smooth. When I was happy with the application, I slowly removed the stencil. I did the same thing like in the previous panel. I cleaned up everything, and for the embossing powder, I used the Mint Mojito from Wow. It's a green glittery embossing powder, and that is why I wanted to add color into the embossing paste, as I thought it will look better. After I applied the embossing powder, I put it on the side so it dries and continued working on the panel with the blue embossing powder. I took my heat gun, got my heat gun nice and hot, and slowly melted the powder. This was a lot of fun to watch. The paste was sort of bubbling when it came in contact with the heat, and this is how it looks once the powder was melted. I really like the look. This embossing powder just reminds me of winter. Then I took the second panel and did the same. I had trouble seeing if the powder was melting. It just looked the same. It wasn't as clear as on the previous panel, but in the end, it turned out great. Here is the finished result in more detail. The embossing powder is really beautiful, very sparkly. And here are the panels side by side. I think the green one is definitely more sparkly. Next, I was going to adhere the panels on top of a colored cardstock. For the blue one, I used a light blue cardstock from papermilldirect. I adhered it using double-sided tape. The green embossed panel I adhered on top of a dark green cardstock, also from papermilldirect. And while I was adhering, I also adhered the panels on top of a heavyweight white card base using the same tape adhesive. For this card, I decided not to use a fan foam or foam adhesive and just adhered it directly on top of the card base. Next, I die cut a snowflake from the colored cardstock and also from the white plain cardstock as the panels I use for the embossing. My idea here was to adhere one colored and one white snowflake behind banner with a sentiment. And for the sentiment, I used the same colored cardstock I use for the snowflakes. I picked the Merry Christmas sentiment from the stamp set Christmas Packages from Avery, Elle. I treated the cardstock with an anti-static powder and then stamped the sentiment using the Versafine ink. For the dark green cardstock, I used a white embossing powder, but for the light blue cardstock, I stamped the sentiment using the Versafine ink in Onyx black and heat embossed it using a clear embossing powder. I just thought the black is better choice as the cardstock was too light for the white embossing powder. I used my heat gun again to melt the powder. Then I trimmed the sentiment using my paper trimmer. I also used my scissors to trim off the sides and cut the right side of the banner at an angle. So the snowflakes don't look too plain. I used the Wing of Stella clear glitter brush pen and applied it across all of the snowflakes. To adhere the snowflakes, I used clear glue dots. The colored snowflake was adhered at the bottom and the white snowflake on top of it. I adhered both snowflakes on top of the panel, making sure the sentiment fits as well. To adhere the sentiment, I used small foam squares, leaving space where the snowflake will be. I also added a glue dot on top of the snowflake in the middle. Then I attached the sentiment, making sure it's adhered properly and is holding. And this finishes up the card. Here are all the cards together. I also made one extra card using a red cardstock and a clear sparkle embossing glitter powder from Wow. I think my favorite is the green card just because it's very sparkly, but I actually like all of them. This is a very simple card, so if you have a stencil, the embossing or texture paste and embossing powder, I would definitely encourage you to give it a try. Hope you guys have enjoyed this video. If you did, I would be very grateful if you gave this video a thumbs up and also subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. The list of the supplies you can find in the video description as well as on my blog, where I will have also more pictures of the cards. This was the card number 10 of my 12 cards for Christmas series. That means there are 9 other cards I made so far. I put all my videos in a playlist called 12 Cards for Christmas 2017. It should be showing on the screen now. If not, I will include a link in the description below. Thank you all so much for watching. Happy holidays, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!